Hi everyone, I'm Josh and welcome back to my channel today. I'm finally giving you my December wrap up. I know this is coming pretty late, but I have a lot of other videos that I want to do and not enough time to do them. So without further ado, let's get into it. This month I read 16 books. That is way more than usual. The page numbers were higher than normal too. That was because I moved during December. I didn't get a lot of work done, and what I did get done though was a lot of reading while moving and organizing things. So it was a great opportunity for that. I do fear that January is catching up with me though, not reading as much as I would have liked to. But December was a pretty good reading month. I had a lot of rereads this month as well, which I think helped with my numbers. You know, just one of those things where I just, you know what you like, and so I know what I like, so I pick up what I like, and it's easy to get through them one by one. There are a lot of these I've already talked about because I've had end of year wrap up type of information, and I'm going to start with the books I already talked about and give you just a brief rundown and refer you to the respective videos. Then I'll talk to you about the books I haven't discussed yet in more detail, which is a small fraction of the total, honestly. So first up, let's talk about the time travel rereads that I did. I basically did an entire video where I revisited some of my favorite time travel books from the top 10 list that I gave, or 10 recommendations I gave for time travel. And I talked about how which of those still stood up and which of those did not work as well as I remembered. Many of them didn't work because they were more sexist than I realized or remembered. First one is going to be Somewhere in Time. This is a creepy stalker story that is made okay because, oh, it's true love. Did not like this. It was, I can't believe, this is the one I'm most embarrassed about, that I did not realize, did not register just how creepy it was the first time I read it. More about that again in that video. This one I think I gave, was it 2 or 3 stars? Around that. Like it was fun enough read, but it had so many problems. It's not just the creepy stalker scenario, but it's the ongoingness. Like, I understand there's a suspension of disbelief that's necessary for the premise of this book. This man sees a woman in a painting as he's dying, he has brain cancer or something, and he wills himself back in time to find her. And the motivation there is very stalkery, which you'll see if you go check out my video about it. But beyond that, every time he starts to go towards her, he puts her in a situation that he feels she's uncomfortable. That doesn't stop him. So it's just this, not just the underlying premise, it's this ongoing mindset that is just very problematic, and I think it gives the wrong message to readers. Next up was Replay by Ken Grimwood. This one I enjoyed more, and as one I've reread several times, and I must say it wasn't as shockery as how bad it was, but some of the things the main character says, the way he sexualizes women, the way he sexualizes children, even if they have the adult mind of a woman, it's creepy as well. This one I think I gave 3 stars as well. Talk about sexualizing women, we have Joel Alderman's The Accidental Time Machine. This is basically a ripoff of H.G. Wells' Time Machine. It features a dynamic between our main character, who's a graduate student who keeps propelling himself forward in time. He comes across a woman who is almost childlike in her naiveness, and naturally she is meant to be connected with him. And what's worst about this book isn't just the sexism, it is the way it tries so hard to be woke, and the way it tries to be, look at me, I'm self-aware and feminist or whatever, and it's so superficial that it's really cringy, and the story itself is just not well executed. This one thing I also gave 3 stars, maybe it was 2 or 3, all of it's like 2 or 3. The last time travel one that I reread that I did not stand up as much as I remember, that's going to be The End of Eternity by Isaac Asimov. This is one that I really loved the first go around, and the second go around I still liked it because it was a great premise here, but it's underlined by Isaac Asimov's basic sexist mentality. So the basic idea you can think of is like in Loki's, the time variant authority is what's going on here. That's what eternity is. It's the time variant authority, and that idea, needless to say, came before Loki, the comic or the show, and it's really compelling, the ideas that are explored, but its underlying structure is patriarchal, and the one woman that's in there is so thinly written, and the mindset around the main character towards her doesn't work. And then the relationship that's forced between him and her, which turns out to be the fundamental foundation to the entire story, is extremely forced and doesn't work. And all of that makes it just what would have been a great book into just a fine book, a fun book. This is the one book out of all of these that I think is still worth reading, but with a keen eye on the problems. This one I think I gave 4 stars. Now, on to continuing on with time travels, but ones that I loved. This one, I reread Chloe O'Brien's History of the Future. I read it about 2 years before this time. I mean, this is about a girl who's coming of age, and she and her friend eat a petrified bat, and it gives them the ability to look in the eyes of people and see into their distant future and distant past, their ancestors, and so on and so forth. And there's two things going on here. It's a reflection on coming of age and understanding one's identity, but also it is about a reflection on the direction of which America is going. And that is one reason why it resonated so strongly with me, was because of the fact that it felt very prescient in a time where women's rights were being taken away and they're actively being discussed by the Supreme Court to repeal Roe v. Wade effectively. And then the attack on the Capitol, this idea of a civil war coming, it's all way too realistic. And this was written some 7 or 8 years ago now. I think I gave this 4.5 stars. Now on to the first 15 Lives of Harry August. This one I really liked. It's like Replay, which I did not tell before, but Replay is about a man who dies when he's like 45, and he wakes up in his younger body and he gets to relive it over and over again. And his focus is sex and money. This is the same premise, except he's reliving his entire life, and it's written by a woman, and our main character is much better fleshed out, and it's just not as problematic as the other one. This one, I think, chooses the groundhog narrative in a way that is just extremely effective and very thought-provoking, with a very compelling story. I talk about this again more in there, but for now I'm just going to leave it at that. 5-star. It's my top 10 favorites of all time. Needless to say, this one's fantastic. If you're wondering why this wasn't on my top fiction of the year, it's because I don't include rereads in my top fiction or top nonfiction of the year. I still intend and hope to do a ranking or showing you all my rereads video, where I'll probably rank from best to worst all the rereads that I did. So that is coming, so you'll at least get to know how I feel about those. I know some people talk about the rereads in the top fiction, but because I actively reread books that I love, it just feels wrong to just keep promoting the same books, especially if I read them every year or every other year. Those are actually all the time travel books. Again, I'll link to those above and below. Next up are a couple books that have to do with a series that I talk about in my series wrap-up and sort of to-do list for this year, 2022. First one was I reread The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice, and to talk about that in there. I really liked it. It was originally a favorite of all time, like in the top 10, like the first 15 Lives of Harry August. Now I understand why, because it resonated with me on a very strong level, and I can understand why it resonated with younger Josh, and I explored that idea more in that video. But I think I gave it 4.5 stars, maybe rounding up, not quite 5. It was a book that was still really good and very thought-provoking. Next up was a book that was just fine. That is The 12, and this is book 2 of the Passage trilogy. I'm not going to be finishing the Passage trilogy because the writing is easy to follow and is exciting into itself, but it's just, I don't feel invested in our characters or our story, and part of that is because it's spanning a huge piece of time, and we're getting introduced to new characters actively, and I don't care about them. I want to follow our main characters. It's about a pandemic where basically vampires start to rule the world, and it follows one main character who's a young girl who got turned into a vampire, and she is one of the original 12, or tangential to them. Well, the 12 are these main vampires who have slightly higher powers. The first one was so good that I remembered it. I read it like a decade or more now, but the second one is one that I DNF'd the first time I tried rereading it. I tried reading it again. It took a lot of effort not to DNF it this time, so it was 2 or 3 stars. It was a book that just did not work for me. Okay, now on to books that are on my top fiction, nonfiction list of the year. Those are again going to be linked above and below. The Matriarch by Barbara Bush. About Barbara Bush by Susan Page. This was one that was a surprise this year. Like, I knew I'd like it because I love Susan Page, and I'm sure she was going to write a good book. I just didn't expect her to make me care about Barbara Bush as much as she did, and make me respect her as much as I do now, despite our differences in belief in how she lived her life. But what this did was not convince me that she made the right choices, but made me understand why she made the choices she did, and why she should be considered a significant figure in history. This was 5 stars, needless to say. Up next is Galileo's Daughter, a biography about Galileo, largely relating to his relationship to the Catholic Church and the intersection between his science and his religion. And there was a lot of emotional connection there that I really liked. I don't agree, obviously, with a lot of his stuff. Maybe it's not obvious to you if you don't know me, but I don't agree with a lot of what his mindset was. But I still thought it was very interesting to see how someone of his caliber and someone so respected in the scientific community sort of framed their way of thinking of the world, especially given the time he lived in. This was one I think I gave 4.5 or 5 stars. Fantastic book. My favorite David Sobel that I've read so far. My favorite fiction book of the year, and potentially one of my favorite books of all time, but I have to reread it before I can officially say that, is going to be Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler. This is the end of the duology of Parable of the Earthseed trilogy, where the idea is we have a far or a near future that is now set in 2015, so it's now near past. And climate change is getting progressively worse, far-right candidates getting into office. Needless to say, this is very reminiscent of what's actually happening. And this just continues that story to where beyond 2015, to further in our main character's life, at this time it's through the perspective of her daughter. And her daughter was reflecting on her mother through her journal writings. And we're getting this picture of what played out mostly from her mother's perspective, but with excerpts from her mother herself and one other character that I don't want to spoil. And this took the main ideas of the first book and it ran with it in a way that I just absolutely adore. The first book I love because of the ideas it sort of looked at, where basic idea being God is change. Everything we touch, we change. Everything we change changes us. Basic idea is we get to shape our own future, or it will shape us. Like, change is inevitable, but we have some say in the direction that change goes. And that's why it's important that we are actively shaping our own futures and societies. And this took that idea and it just said, okay, let's say this actually happens. Let's try and do that. How likely is it to actually succeed? And what happens, and what are the critiques of it? Because we get so many critiques, particularly from her own daughter, towards this idea, this new religion. And it was that new exploration, that new way of exploring it, thinking of it, that made it work so well. Plus the fact that it's basically psychic. 5 stars. Okay, now on to the books that I haven't talked about with you all yet. And we're going to go with One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America by Kevin M. Kruse. This is one that I liked. I think I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. I think it might be closer to 3.5 though. It's a book that was interesting, had an interesting story to tell, but it felt boring all the time. Like, I DNF'd it the first. It's one of those books I DNF'd, had to return to a while back. Like, it wasn't an active decision. I just stopped reading it. And the book itself, though, is split into 2 basic structures. You have this initial Eisenhower era where we can see the creation of this mindset of of America being a Christian nation, how that get ingrained into certain laws or certain traditions, like having a God we trust on the money or in the Pledge of Allegiance, all that happening back in the 1950s, surprise, surprise. And then from there we see how the relationship between religion and America, or the government, evolves, Christian America specifically, evolves moving forward from when that happened to today. An interesting book. One that, I think it needs to be heard. I'm not sure how easy it'll be to convince people. Some people think this is a Christian nation. It's not. Technically, it has been the last 50 or 60, 70 years because someone tried to reframe America that way. But the Constitution is certainly not Christian. But it's a bigger conversation to have. I just wish the book was a little bit more compelling sometimes. Okay, next up is Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. I read this because I got this as a gift from my stepmother about 6 months ago, and I have a rule, and actually that's why she bought this for me. So if you buy me or give me a gift, you gift me a book that you want me to read, I will make a point to read it within 6 months. And so the clock was ticking, and I didn't want to renege on my promise. And so I read it, and this started very strong. I loved the writing, I loved the tone, the comedic tone. I don't usually read comedy books, but in the end, I would say it was, I think I can read it 4 stars, but I'm trying to be more strict this year, where I say if I like versus really like something. And I want to say it's probably more like 3.5, because I did like this, and in parts I really liked it. But at the core of it, the story didn't work that well for me. It's this idea of there was these people who were anxious because they were being held hostage by this person who was robbed a bank and now had to accidentally get caught in the situation. And the way it plays out is overly sentimental, which I understand is just an approach, but it just all felt unbelievable. and he tries to circumvent certain expectations in a way that I don't think worked that well. Like he says, like the way he structures our villain, our quote unquote villain, and certain reveals that come about them is supposed to, I think, circumvent expectations, but then the way things play out feels like it's going the opposite direction. Like what he tried to actively circumvent is now sort of pushing this main rhetoric. I don't want to spoil it, so I can't say, but I feel like it's sort of counteract his own points, and I don't think it was as effective as he would have liked. But also the way in which he went about it was just not believable. The way in which the story was resolved was just too convenient for my taste. So I think I gave it 3.5, rounding up to 4 stars. Now, I had some arcs as well to try and get through. Actually, before the arcs, I'll talk about the one book I don't have pulled out physically, and that is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I read this, I think I reread it the last 5 years almost. And obviously I love it. It's my top 10 favorites of all time. 5 stars again. I will say that I may have to stop reading it every year though, because it is getting kind of a chore. Like as much as I love the story, it's like you're reading it every year. It's hard for it to be original. What it is nice though is that there are 1,000 different narrators for this story. So there is some level of uniqueness there. I try to make sure I mix up who I'm listening to in a given year. Okay, next up is The Memory Collectors by Kim Neville. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. Neville, maybe? And this one I think I gave 3 or 3.5 stars, probably closer to 3, because I did like it, but not much love, unfortunately. The basic idea is about this girl who feels the emotions people leave on objects, and it's about her life. Now, the story starts out very strong, and I think, oh, this writing is right up my alley. I love it. I love the tone it seems to be approaching, because there was like this. It felt like we were exploring this line of, is this real power or is this psychological? That direction I would have adored. I would have loved that kind of analysis, because even if it was just in her mind, which is made explicitly clear, that's not a plot point I'm spoiling, it's just is the basis, it's the premise of the story. If it was that line we're walking, is it in her mind or is it not? The implications are not any different. I mean, the way in which it affects her life as a feeling these things is not much different than if it was actually happening. It's still something she has to reckon with. And that same idea is explored in in the Earthseed duology, where our main character, because of a certain drug her mom took during birth, means that she can feel people's pain. That they can feel their emotion. If they're excited, if they're happy, if they're in pain, she sees it. She will start to feel it, and it is purely psychological. At least that is how it's addressed in the show. At least not the show, the book series. While here it's the opposite, and I would have liked it being more ambiguous. But in the end, again, it's not. And then we move forward with the idea, and it becomes a greater story about her meeting with another memory collector of sorts. I just was very bored. The story, like the premise was so interesting. And in the end, though, it just all felt lackluster. It was like the story we got just didn't work for me. I wasn't that invested, and I was so sad because it started so strong. I was so convinced this was going to be a great book. Like, it was one of those books that you feel like, oh, this could be 5-star, but it didn't do what I wanted. It didn't do what I needed it to do, which was keep me interested. Hence it getting a 3 to 3.5 stars, probably closer to 3. This is one that I actually chose this book because it's underrated. I haven't heard people talk about it. It was one that I requested a while back, and it was on my list of e-arcs I need to read, and so I figured I should pick one that's not popular, and so I did, and unfortunately now I see why it's not very popular. This next book, it's called Yes, Daddy, and I hate giving it such a low rating, because I gave it between 2 and 3 stars, probably closer to 2, because despite the fact that the story was compelling and I was very interested throughout it, I did not feel like it had anything to say. Like, this is a story about a man who basically gets into an abusive relationship, and he gets abused significantly, sexually and mentally, and it's about power dynamics and the way celebrities with power can use their money and leverage to get what they want, and at the cost of anyone else. But there was one problem that it just felt like it went so far it was almost hard to believe. It was a little too extreme, like, to be believable. But that wasn't my real problem. My real problem was that this kind of story, there's a fine line you have to walk on why you're telling the story. Is it a story that needs to be told? And if so, what is the reason behind it? And I get the author tried to give a message, an underlying message to the narrative, but it felt shoehorned in. It felt like it wasn't really about that. It felt like it was about using an emotionally traumatizing situation to get the reader to feel strongly. And then that way the reader might mistake their strong emotions with a quality book. And the two do not connect, especially when you're, in my opinion, you are exploiting something for gain more than you're actually using it to analyze it and give some genuine contribution to a conversation. And that for me is why this book just didn't work. And I'm hesitant to do that because I love a good cringy book. Like I talk about it in my review on NetGalley and on Goodreads about how like I love a good horror story that's just gruesome for the sake of it. But even then, I feel like there's just this doesn't feel the same, because that is the point. There is like the way in which you approach a horror story is different than what's going on here. Like there is it's a different way. It's the level of catharsis that comes with that versus here. Maybe I'm being a little unfair, a little double what's the word I'm looking for? Being hypocritical here. But it was something I couldn't give a better rating to because of just how serious it felt and how poorly it was handled. I'm curious to hear your thoughts based off if you've read this or just based off what I've told you, if that seems reasonable, because I do fear that I'm being hypocritical here and how I'm judging this book versus all the gruesome horror books that I read that seem to just use horror or use emotionally triggering situations just for the sake of it. But I still feel like it's different in a situation than say just like some demonic situation or even just watching the movie Saw, something like that. I don't know. I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts, assuming I gave you enough information to go on. And those are the books. I don't have page numbers for you. Needless to say, though, it was a great month for reading. Even the books that weren't good were extremely thought-provoking. And that, I think, is what I want from a bad book. A book that makes me think, makes me feel strongly towards it. Even Yes, Daddy. In a way, I critique it for just trying to make me feel, but it makes me think about why I have a problem with it in the first place, which I appreciate. But those are all the books that I read. Thanks so much for watching. I hope my January picks up better than it has been and ends up being as great as December, but I don't think it will be at this point. But that's all right. Everyone have a great day, and until next time, stay safe.